Okay, here we go. Stand by. 3, 2, 1, action.
Assume nothing.
Brash, bald-faced blasphemy.
Question everything.
I find it extremely hard to imagine.
Open your eyes.
It is quite all right to be an atheist.
The fastest growing group of people in the country has been measured as being those who have no belief or who are atheists.
You don't have to be apologetic or quiet about it.
Challenge the opposition.
You see religion on 100 fronts losing the argument.
And start thinking. This is The Thinking Atheist Worldwide.
I remember when I was a Christian, I used to feel insulted at this notion that human beings were animals. You know, the human animal? And of course, my world has since expanded, and the explorations into the human animal have expanded. You know, what makes us human? Our similarities and the differences we have with other animals, and how things like traditions and diet and stress and social status, brain chemistry, elements from without and from within help to define us as individual human beings. Well, Dr. Robert Sapolsky, he is a professor of biological sciences, neurology, and neurosurgery at Stanford. He's author of several books about the human brain. He teaches the lecture, Being Human, Life Lessons from the Frontiers of Science at the Great Courses Plus. This is a wonderful exploration into what makes us human, what sets us apart as humans. It's just one of over 8,000 lectures at the Great Courses Plus that stream or download directly to your TV, your computer, your laptop, or smartphone. Tons of topics on a ton of subjects, everything from brain science to law to religion to finance to wine tasting, to learn how to play the guitar, and so much more. I want you to experience the Great Courses Plus too. You can sign up today. As one of my listeners, you get a full month of unlimited access to all of their video lectures for free, but you have to use my special URL. So start your free month. You will love it. Sign up at thegreatcoursesplus.com/Seth. That's thegreatcoursesplus.com/Seth. FYI, I'm going to be in Orlando, Florida, the weekend of October 20th at the Florida Free Thought Convention, Free Flow 2017. Big lineup of speakers. Dr. Eugenie Scott's going to be there. David Silverman of American Atheist. The Psy Babe, Yvette D'Entremont's going to be speaking. Many others. You can still get your tickets. Go to freeflow, F-L-O, freeflow.org. I'll see you there in Orlando the weekend of October the 20th. Coming up on next week's broadcast, it is our annual Halloween tradition. It is ghost stories. And then the week after that, we're doing our show on fears and phobias to sort of keep in with the Halloween theme. So if you have an irrational or even a rational fear, but I think the irrational ones are more fun to talk about, you can send that to podcast@thethinkingatheist.com. Okay? Today's broadcast is the result of a message sent to me by a friend and fellow activist, Hemant Mehta at The Friendly Atheist, who had been partnering with a woman named Camille Beredjick on the production of a book called Queer Disbelief. And I was intrigued by the premise. And so this conversation is going to be about what this whole concept is. And then with their permission, I'm going to actually read a portion of the book for you here on the radio so you can find out what we're talking about. And that book excerpt will happen as the last segment of the show, okay? Joining me for today's show, a couple of very special guests. I'll start with Hemant Mehta. He is admin and blogger and host of The Friendly Atheist. He's played an active role in the development of the material that we're going to be talking about today. Hemant Mehta, great to have you, man.
Thank you, Seth. Good to talk to you.
How are things at The Friendly Atheist? You post like every 5 minutes. Is it you, or do you have a staff of minions that you control? What's going on over there?
As much as I would love more minions, there are a couple of people who help me out with certain articles, but for the most part, yeah, it's me with a little bit of help. But there's so much news, so it's hard not to cover certain things anymore. But I'm also fortunate that, you know, this is what I do full time.
I just picture you over there like, you know, you've got the robot army kind of thing. I don't know, that's why I said that to begin with. There are two people in this world that I get frustrated with because they post awesome stuff and they get to it before I do. There's George Takei and there's Hemant Mehta. And between you guys, I'm like, well, shit, they just posted that a half an hour ago. Otherwise, I'd do it. So
that's some good company, man.
I have some professional jealousy, I guess, with you. I have another special guest I want to welcome to the broadcast. Her name is Camille Beredjick. So glad you're here, Camille. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Seth.
Okay, so who wrote the book? Which one of you?
That is all Camille.
Camille, tell me about Queer Disbelief. What's the point? What's the angle? What's the book?
The point is that there's a huge overlap between the LGBTQ world and the atheist world that some folks within those communities are addressing, but I think that we're not doing enough. So the overarching theme of the book is the ways that religion has affected LGBTQ people, both positively and negatively, and the ways that atheists can make a positive difference to LGBT communities. So we look at the historical and current ways that these two groups have similar experiences. So that's things like coming out to religious families or being locked out of politics, persecution at the international level, being subject to societal discrimination based on things like perceived morality. But we also take care to really emphasize the differences. So there are some very real legislative and social hurdles to LGBT civil rights today that atheists simply don't face in the same way.
This is something I've heard quite a bit. We should emulate some of the gay rights activism and the LGBTQ activism and sort of emulate their method so that we might gain many of the inroads that they gained and continue to work toward gaining in the future. Do you see that having merit? We should sort of mirror what their tactics have been?
I absolutely see some merit in that. And, a lot of the people that I spoke with who do some level of atheist or secular organizing have said that the things that have really brought such dramatic advances in the LGBTQ civil rights movement lately are things like storytelling and getting to know folks on an individual level and seeing how these issues are about more than just, constitutional rights writ large or religious discrimination as a big, scary theoretical concept, but it affects people's lives on a day-to-day basis. Their families, their ability to work and build the lives that they want. So once we start looking at these issues as something that way, instead of something that's a very big thematic, like, oh, religious discrimination, I don't know what we're ever going to do about that, it can be a little bit easier to sort of get your point across and make real change.
Why does this resonate so much with you? Where's the fire in your belly come from?
Well, the fire in my belly comes from both of these things. So I myself am queer. I'm an atheist. I grew up with parents of two different religions who taught me about both holidays and gave me the foods and the presents that went with both of those holidays, but never really taught me any of the beliefs. And so starting on sort of a shaky religious foundation to begin with, once I realized that I was queer in high school and I learned about all of the things that religion said about people like me, I had less and less reason to ever really care strongly about faith. And then eventually it didn't take much time to see that I just the belief wasn't there for me on a personal level. So since I started writing for Hemant's site about 5 years ago, I've been thinking more and more about what it means to occupy both of those identities at once and how there's so much potential for collaboration between these two groups that does happen sometimes, but that I think could happen so much more.
I'm going to come back to you in just a second, Hemant. Can you walk me, Camille, through the term queer? Now, you're talking to a cis male who is on the outside looking in and desperate and eager to discover what all of these things mean to whoever. What do you mean when you say queer?
Absolutely. So queer can have a couple of different meanings. So in the title of the book, we're using it to talk about, it sort of has two meanings in the title as well. Queer is sometimes used as an umbrella term for all LGBTQ plus identities because there are a lot of words that don't fit under that acronym. But of course, the word queer does have a history as an anti-gay slur. So there are mixed feelings about it within this broader LGBTQ community. Some folks use it as like a personal identifier. I'm one of the people who's comfortable saying I'm queer as a word that describes me. And for the folks who do that, it usually means it's sort of a synonym for saying that it's either a sexual orientation or a gender identity that's somewhere outside the straight cisgender mainstream. So I talk about this a little bit in the book. I try to be careful to not refer to a person as queer if that's not an identity that they claim for themselves, because there is a lot of sort of difficult history around the word. But when we also talk about it in sort of an academic framework, queer refers to things that are a little bit unusual and a little bit strange and that challenge our expectations. So the title is sort of a play on that. It's talking about how LGBTQ issues and atheism overlap. But also, even though the numbers of atheists are growing in the US, it's still very much a minority. So in that way, atheism is in itself sort of queer, if you use queer in that way. So
has there been some pushback, though, from the LGBTQ? I mean, have you received people who've said, how dare you use this slanderous term, this slur, this word that's been used for so long to dehumanize people?
Oh, certainly. And I think anyone who uses it receives that kind of pushback regardless. I mean, I took a number of classes in college that had queer in the title, right? So it's when you talk about it in terms of like a field of study or a general subject, I think that it's a lot more accepted. But I don't know. I think the biggest issue comes up when you try to ascribe that label to people who don't want to use it, which is why. So for me, when I talk about my friends in my community who I know are okay with it, I might say queer community. But in cases like in the book, and when I'm talking to people whose identities I don't necessarily know, then I'm going to try to shy away from it. So the pushback is definitely there. I think it's about recognizing people's individual boundaries and saying, like, what works for me may not work for you. And on the flip side, like, if your experience with this term is hurtful, then I can respect that, but also recognize the parameters within which I can claim this word as well.
Hemant Mehta, you've done some writing well beyond the Friendly Atheist blog. Real fast, let's talk about the books you've written.
Well, I've written a couple now. So one was I Sold My Soul on eBay, where I visited a whole bunch of churches as an atheist for the first time in my life because I wasn't raised a Christian. There was another one I wrote called The Young Atheist Survival Guide, which focused more on the sort of struggles that younger atheists have to deal with in high school and college and ways that everyone could help them out because there were certain struggles that are hard to come by.
It's funny, you and I are in this position where we, we're admins of communities and we speak, and we're out there sort of on the front lines in some contexts, and I'm amazed and flattered, and it's always a hugely wonderful gesture when someone comes up and he says, please read my book. Like, I've got a book. I've written a book. Here, have a book. So after you leave a convention or after you open your mailbox after several weeks, you have a pile of books that the laws of physics simply declare you will not have time to read or acknowledge. There's something about Camille's book that stood out for you. You want to talk about that?
Yeah. So if I can go back a little bit, Camille mentioned that she'd been writing for my site for a few years, and usually she took on the stories where atheism and religion overlapped with LGBTQ issues. And her posts were always wonderful. I mean, she knew how to blog. She knew how to give her opinion on all these issues in a, objective, I thought, fair way without, she also put her opinion in it too, but I thought always in a fair way. But here's the issue for me. A lot of times when I've posted about LGBTQ issues, suppose with President Obama, suppose with President Trump, if there's an issue that comes up, there will inevitably be someone commenting saying, what does this have to do with atheism? What does this have to do with God? And that they'll say this about anything. I could post about immigration. I could post about anything that's happening in the news right now. And it seems like if it's not directly connected to does God exist, there will be some backlash from some people saying, what's the point? Why are you the person talking about this issue? And part of it is, well, I can talk about whatever I want to. But the other part of it is there is a connection because, right now, a lot of what Donald Trump does is guided by his overwhelmingly evangelical Christian base. I mean, it's the one big advisory group that didn't leave his side after all the stuff that happened in Charlottesville. So to me, there is a very clear connection between things that happen policy-wise and things that happen with religion. Now, the problem is, if you asked me something more tangential, like why are you covering transgender bathroom bills that are going on across the country? I don't know that I, like you said, as a cis straight guy, I don't know that I can always articulate that really well. I mean, I can try to make the case that I just presented to you, but it sometimes gets muddled up. I'm not the best person to say, like, well, look, there are religious people who are influencing, this issue, and that's why we got to talk about it. And it's even harder for me to say this is why atheists specifically should care about these issues. Because if you care about science education, if you care about rational thinking, it seems to me there are certain things we ought to be able to get behind. And so this is the issue that I brought to Camille, saying, look, I know there's a connection here. I think we can make this case for why atheists ought to be on the side of LGBT rights. And it's not that a lot of atheists are not on that side, but they're not always vocal. It's not the primary thing that's their driving force. And the question was, like, I don't know how to articulate that well. And I know Camille might have a better answer to that. And so this is the discussion we had. This is how we came up with the outline for the book. And then she got to work. And Seth, to go back to your thing about all those books we get, I've read many books, or I've tried to read many books that kind of cover this overlap specifically. And a lot of times it's only saying, look, here's the religious argument against same-sex marriage. Here's the atheist rebuttal to that, or here's the here's the problem with the Christian argument for why we shouldn't have same-sex marriage, stuff like that. I have very rarely, if ever, I can't remember a time I saw a book where someone laid out, look, atheists, you specifically, this has to be your issue as well, and here's why. And the short answer is a lot of the same things that oppress LGBTQ people also have an effect on us. It's often the oppression happens for some of the same reasons by the same people. And even more than that, this is something we all have to care about. Camille talked about why we know why religion hurts LGBTQ progress. But what I never really talk about, or I never really hear about, is when it helps them. And I was surprised as I was reading through Camille's drafts, like she talked to people who are gay Muslims, or I think she had a bisexual Southern Baptist in there too. And it was amazing to hear their voices too, because I've never heard those voices before. And I'm sure the reaction from your listeners, and I know it was going through my head, is how do these people exist? How do they find a way to make sense of these different identities of theirs? And what should we do about that? Should we just tell them you're wrong about religion? And, who are we to say that? So these are complicated issues. And there are some things I can respond to fairly well. There are other things that I am in the dark about. And so this is where Camille, having her foot kind of in both communities and having studied this stuff and worked around these issues in a way that I certainly haven't, and I haven't seen books that really describe all that stuff. I mean, when I read the drafts of the book, I was just amazed that, wow, this covers so many things that are interesting to me as an atheist who cares about these issues, and I haven't seen this stuff anywhere else.
I'm going to come back to Camille on some of the profiles in question, and I want to ask about coming out as an atheist and as someone who is non-hetero. But regarding the social issues, I've seen the same phenomenon in some of my pages as well, and I'm fascinated by it. I think you can only do so many shows that say there is no evidence for any God anywhere. I mean, once you and I then take the next logical step from atheism to humanism, or speaking about how religion impacts the different social issues of the day, which does speak to gay marriage and trans rights and, all these other great many issues come into play. We start actually becoming proactive instead of talking about what we don't believe in. And we talk about what we are about. There seem to be a lot of people who blanch and say, whoa, hey, I didn't sign up for this. And call me naive, but I find it just odd. Like, wouldn't we want to talk about the things that we are about and not just the gods we don't believe in? Does that ever strike you?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And there are some responses to that, which is to say, if we're talking about humanism, that is what we are. And that's different from talking about atheism. But to me, the bigger issue here is, if you are an atheist, is that kind of the end of the road for you? Or what does that mean? To me, yes, I'm an atheist, but God isn't the end goal for me. Trying to convince someone that God doesn't exist, that's nice. I mean, I hope I can help people do that, but I wouldn't be satisfied if that's where it ended, because I think, and tell me again if I'm wrong here, Seth, like, for me, what I hope I can do is to teach people how to think critically about certain issues, how to, the scientific method and trying to come to some sort of objective reality about a situation, looking at data. That is all part of this broader critical thinking idea. That is kind of the whole monster there, not just the head of it. Yeah. And that's the bigger issue here. And so when we talk about a lot of the stuff going on in politics, when we talk about how do we raise children, things like that, to me, that is part of my atheist identity, because yes, God is one part of that, but so is putting a rational, critical brain on some of these issues. Because if we can't do that, what good does it do if you're an atheist who still holds a lot of irrational beliefs? Like, I think we would look at a person who is an atheist but says, I believe the earth is flat. You would say that's ridiculous, because the same sort of critical thinking you use to abandon the idea of God, you ought to be able to put that toward these factual, geographical, astronomical, whatever you want to call it. Shouldn't we be able to use that thinking and put it everywhere? So these are all part of the same thing for me. And that's why it is frustrating when you get those comments over and over and over. But this isn't, you don't have to just be like, oh, you're a humanist, then only you can talk about this stuff. It's, what is the purpose of your atheism, if not to push a sort of critical thinking, rationally thinking mindset?
Hemant Mehta of The Friendly Atheist. Camille Beredjick, let's talk about coming out. I hear some people say it was harder to come out as an atheist than it was to come out gay, or vice versa. They make these comparisons. Any of those speak to you? Do you have any thoughts or perspectives on them?
Sure, I've definitely heard both. I think a lot of it depends on the community in which you were raised, the folks who you grew up around, what your family and your parents are like. For my personal experience, it was much more difficult to come out as bisexual, is technically like the identity that I most closely identify with.
Well, no, hang on. Let me camp out there for just a second. And you decide where the boundary is. I'll ask questions. If we're in a zone of discomfort for you, we'll just stop. But what was that moment like? How did you approach them?
So my coming out story is not as exciting as a lot of them, because when I discovered that I was also into girls, I was maybe 17 or 18, because I still had feelings for men as well. I went about it saying, okay, this is a part of me that I can actually put away altogether rather. I said, okay, I'm quote unquote one of the lucky ones, because I can just pretend to not be interested in women and just date guys for the rest of my life. So I quickly realized that wasn't going to happen based on the people that I was interested in and the relationships that I was having. And actually, I was on my way out the door to a pride parade with a couple of friends at age 17, 18. And my mom asked me, is there something you want to tell us? And I said, oh yeah, by the way, I'm bi. No pun intended, although it was kind of great.
Have a nice day.
Exactly.
See you later.
And spent the whole day panicking and freaking out and not knowing what I was going to do. And my parents were a little bit weirded out by it, because they, no one ever knows what their kid is going to be like, right? We all, if you grow up wanting a kid, you have like a vision of what maybe their life would be. And having a kid who was gay was not part of my parents' plan. So they struggled with it for a little bit, but eventually came around and are now incredibly supportive. But when it comes to not believing in God, they didn't really have a strict mindset for me ahead of time. My mom is Catholic and my dad is Jewish. So like I said, I grew up with twice as many holidays, but not really any of the beliefs. So I don't think they ever had a kid thinking, oh, she's going to be, this kind of faith or that kind of faith. Whereas being queer was a little bit more jarring to them.
Camille, Hemant had brought up some interesting, even eclectic profiles of people that you had sort of mentioned in the book. And would you like to elaborate on some of the cases that come to mind, some of the stories that stick?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm so humbled by the stories that people shared with me and the different backgrounds that folks opened up about. So like Hemant said, I spoke to one person who was bisexual and who grew up Southern Baptist and who had to do a little bit of church hopping as an adolescent to find where they would be accepted. I talked to one absolutely brilliant trans woman who grew up Orthodox, actually Hasidic Jewish, and coming from a very conservative Jewish background, and has recently come out both as an atheist and as a trans woman. And either one of those revelations alone would have completely shocked her community, but she's talking to them about both at once and really discovering what it means to be on both of those journeys. Like Hemant said, I talked to somebody on the LGBTQ spectrum who was Muslim, who started an online community for other Muslims to kind of find themselves and figure out the ways that that coming out when you're Muslim is different from coming out when you're Christian or secular or something else. So a lot of really fascinating people. And also, like Hemant said, a lot of progressive people of faith, whether they are LGBTQ or not. A few folks who were trans and who were Christian, and coming to terms with both of those things and what their Bible says about gender and biology. So all kinds of really fascinating things. I wish I could have talked to people forever and made the book longer and longer and longer. But, eventually you have to say, all right, this is for volume 2.
Camille, you ever hit a wall when you're speaking to people in the atheist movement? They don't bring the baggage of religion, or at least not overtly bring the baggage of religion, but they just don't get a gender beyond male, females, and they don't get a sexual orientation beyond straight. Do you encounter that?
I didn't see it so much in the atheists that I spoke to. Most of them were generally pretty forward thinking when it comes to sexuality, gender to begin with. So we were in a similar place for a lot of the conversation. But I did spend a lot of time on places like Reddit, which is a huge hub for atheist conversation, to figure out what people were saying about this. And there's, this same conversation that comes up again and again. Do LGBTQ issues belong in this forum? Why are we talking about this? And so there's while atheists do skew progressive on these issues, there's definitely a solid contingent that says, God or no God, there's only 2 genders, or there's only gay or straight, or gay marriage is wrong. You name the issue, there's an atheist who holds a particular position on it.
This is one of the fascinating things that I really want to have this conversation with a lot of atheists, which is to say, Camille mentioned she spoke to a lot, several anyway, LGBTQ religious people. So, for example, if there was a trans Orthodox Jew or a gay Muslim or something, one question that I have for a lot of atheists is, what do you do with that information if you found out someone that you were at least good acquaintances with shared that identity? And I think there are some atheists who would say it seems like such a contradiction. And my first reaction would be, I have to explain to them why they can't be gay and Muslim because the holy books say this and that. And I think there are other atheists who would say, well, who cares? Even if it might seem logically contradictory to you, this person figured out a way to make it work, and they're on the side of these progressive issues. So shouldn't we work together with them on that? Isn't that more important than proving them wrong about this religious hypocrisy or not? And that was one of the questions that I constantly was thinking about when we talk about, do we partner with like religious allies who are supportive of LGBT rights? Or do we say, no, they're religious, so we oppose what they believe in terms of God. So do we make allies with them on a different issue or not? I know groups like the Secular Coalition for America, which does lobbying work, they've had to ask themselves this question, do we partner with religious groups on shared progressive policies? Or do we say we're primarily atheists, so we don't want to work with religion because religion is the problem, religion is the root of all evil or what have you. So these are important questions that I haven't really seen addressed in depth, but that came up a lot, I think. And it was interesting reading those profiles of some of those people who are in religious circles, but also in LGBTQ circles, and trying to figure out how they manage it and also how atheists could or should react to that.
Religion certainly does reveal the talent we have as human beings for cherry picking. I mean, I just think of all the stuff, even as a devout Christian, that I just chose to skip or ignore and and everybody's religion, they just go through the cafeteria and they select the delicious morsels and they leave the rest, and everybody's meal looks a little bit different. And you mentioned the SCA, Secular Coalition for America. What a great example, as they often team with even religious organizations to protect the church-state line. There are churches in place who do believe that faith is a private thing, not a government thing, and SCA partners with them for a greater good, building bridges of dialogue and humanizing each other along the way. That's just a fantastic point. So.
Yeah, and by the way, with all of those profiles, Camille did ask, I think, just about all of those people how they reconcile those two views, because I think I know for me, just speaking for myself, I did not know how they made that work. And so she asked them, isn't this just a form of cherry picking? I think across the board. And they all had different answers as to how they answered that question, because some of them, I think, freely admitted they were cherry picking. Other ones said, no, this is my interpretation of my holy book, and it perfectly aligns with my identities.
You see them squirm in their chairs at all, Camille, when you sort of ask them to jive with the fundamentals of their faith? What was some of the reactions you saw?
I think by now everyone has heard that question so many times that they're just like, they're either immune to it, or they have their answers ready to go, or they just like, they've thought about this consciously for a very long time. Like when I ask somebody who's, for example, a transgender man who's very active in the Catholic Church, and who even feels called to be a priest one day, when I say, how do you reconcile participating in a church that is so homophobic and in some ways transphobic, I'm not the first person who's ever asked him that. I'm not making him do a great amount of, novel thinking by putting him on the spot that way, because everyone who has encountered him in his life has asked him that. We are not really doing anything new by saying like, oh, religion and LGBTQ identity don't necessarily always jive, because we get that and we've seen that. I think we're at like a new turning point in this conversation where we're saying, okay, people are making it work for them. And maybe the holy book from so many centuries ago isn't necessarily the thing that's guiding this conversation anymore. Maybe faith looks different to people nowadays, especially those who live in ways that, that their Bible doesn't necessarily approve of.
Two questions left here before I read an excerpt from Camille's book. The first is the book for non-heterosexuals? Is it targeted to LGBTQ or beyond?
No, you definitely don't have to be. In fact, I think it's going to be mostly beneficial for those who don't have a ton of experience in the LGBTQ arena. I think, straight cisgender atheists are really the perfect audience for it, because I'm speaking to the things that at least the ones who I spoke with told me were their values and their principles and the things that kept them grounded, both in atheist identity and also in life. But I think anybody can benefit from it. Anyone who is interested in advancing equal rights or secular rights or collaboration from communities, I think, can benefit this book, regardless of how you identify or what you believe in.
Hemant Mehta, this was the educational experience you'd hoped for when you read the stuff coming in from Camille?
Yeah, and if I can share a quick story, when I read The God Delusion, and I read it when it came out, I was already an atheist, so it didn't really have an impact on my life like it has for a lot of other atheists. But I remember around that same period, I read Daniel Dennett's Breaking the Spell. And to me, that book was mind-blowing, because I had never thought about some of the issues that he brought up in that book. Like, it was so cool to read a book where there were so many new ideas that made so much sense. So I love that. I haven't felt that way about a book since I read what Camille wrote, because as someone who writes about this stuff and talks about this stuff all the time, she explored issues that I have never seen brought up in any other forum. So I am telling you, as an atheist who, as much as I might want to be friendly, part of me feels like a firebrand at times, but I'm telling you, as a straight cis guy, I learned so much from reading this book, and it is not stuff I see in other areas of like my atheist life. And I hope, if anything, it helps move that conversation forward, where I would like to think that for a lot of atheists, okay, it's a default. We are I wish we would all be totally pro LGBT rights and for these against these awful transgender bathroom bills and whatever the issue is going to be tomorrow when this one's done with. I know it's not that easy, but this is the whole point where we address these issues. Hopefully we figure out what the common ground is, and then we can move forward together as a stronger group.
With the Queer Disbelief book project, we're near the finish line, but not over it. So tell me how we can help you.
Sure, I can jump in here, and then Camille, if you want to add anything, if you go to Kickstarter and type and search for Queer Disbelief, you should be able to find the project. Anything you can chip in, there is a certain amount where you can purchase or pre-order anyway the paperback copy of the book. There's an option for an ebook, and whatever you can do to help us take it over the finish line, because we want to make sure this is a high quality product for everyone who gets it. And I'm telling you, it is worth it because it is really good. And it's not a skinny book either. It's a pretty long book. I mean, when you spend more than a year on a project and you take it as seriously as Camille did, you're going to get a lot of quality in a lot of pages. I mean, it's worth it.
Camille, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'll echo all of that. I mean, it was such an incredible experience to write. Like I said, I'm really grateful to everybody who chimed in with their stories, and anything that you can add would be very helpful. I think that this book could do a lot of good for all of our communities and those of us who belong to more than one of them. So I'm really excited to see the final product.
Camille Beredjick, Hemant Mehta. The book is called Queer Disbelief. I will include the Kickstarter link in the description box of this broadcast. If you feel it a worthy project, and I hope you do, I hope you'll support it with a few bucks. And if you meet your goal, let's say in the next few months or what have you, what's our target for release on this sucker?
I think we're aiming for December is when we hope to send all these out. We're just putting together the final actual product. The book is written, but we just got to get it in your hands. So that's what we're working on right now.
To both of you for your time and your input, thank you. And, best wishes on the project. We'll see if we can help you out. And again, the link is in the description box for anybody and everybody who wants to jump on board. Thank you both for being a part of the broadcast today. Greatly appreciated.
Thank you to your audience, and thank you, Seth.
Thank you so much for having us.
If you would like a commercial-free version of this broadcast and a bonus show every month, become a patron. You can go to patreon.com/Seth Andrews. I'm hugely thankful for my sponsors, but also for my patrons. And so if you'd like a commercial-free show and a bonus show every month, patreon.com/Seth Andrews. And thank you very much for the support. And now an excerpt from the book Queer Disbelief, written by Camille Beredjick. This is from the introduction, I believe. The New York Times headline read, "Mormons tipped scale in ban on gay marriage." 10 days earlier, November 4th, 2008, California voters had approved Proposition 8, a ballot initiative to ban same-sex marriage in the state. It had been a tiresome campaign full of anti-gay rhetoric, intense community engagement, and warring editorials about the, quote, real definition of marriage. The measure was a turning point in California's years-long debate on marriage equality, and it was promoted heavily by conservative religious groups, in particular the well-connected Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormon Church, spun Prop 8 into a victory at the 11th hour. According to leaders of the group Protect Marriage, supporters of Prop 8, Mormons made up the vast majority of door-to-door canvassers for the anti-marriage equality clause. They devised a host of specific talking points against marriage equality, using different arguments based on whether or not the voters they spoke to were religious. On Election Day, they even helped get voters to the polls, but they were careful not to use church buildings as meeting places or a home base, according to the Times, quote, so as not to even give the appearance of politicking at the church. And while LDS members comprised only 2% of California's population, Mormons around the country raised as much as half of the nearly $40 million it took to repeal marriage equality. Other churches were involved in passing Prop 8 too, particularly the Catholic Church. But the urgency of the Mormon Church's involvement, its aggressive fundraising, and its commitment to canvassing were unparalleled. The 2008 vote was among the first of many chapters in Proposition 8's long story. Protests erupted throughout California immediately upon the measure's passing. Over the course of several years, court after court struck down Prop 8 as unconstitutional, giving same-sex couples hope that their rights to marry would be restored. But it wasn't until a 2013 Supreme Court ruling that same-sex couples could finally marry again in California, and it took another 2 years for the court to extend that right to same-sex couples nationwide. 2 years after the vote, and before U.S. District Judge Vaughn Walker overturned Prop 8, the Public Religion Research Institute conducted a survey of Californians about whether they'd vote for it again. Just 22% of Californians told PRRI that Prop 8's passage was a good thing. 29% believed it was a bad thing, and 45% believed it had made no difference. When asked whether they'd vote in favor of marriage equality tomorrow, 51% said yes. The survey also documented the role of faith in shaping opinions on LGBTQ, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer questioning rights, particularly when religious leaders brought the issue into the pews. PRRI reported significant Catholic-Protestant differences in how often various groups heard about homosexuality at church, with Protestants going over the topic more frequently than Catholics. Every major religious group except mainline Protestants heard more negative than positive images about LGBTQ people at their place of worship. And what happened in the pulpit had an impact at the polls. Religious Californians who had heard negative messages about LGBTQ people at church were far less likely to support marriage equality. Looking back, the campaign for Proposition 8 is a prime example of what happens when religious groups unite against LGBTQ people. Prop 8's chief strategist Frank Schubert told the New York Times that his contingent did not want to frame the debate as a battle between people of faith and the gays, as that would be a losing formula. But that's exactly what happened. Despite not wanting to be seen as anti-gay, religious advocates for Prop 8 supported a measure that, by its very name, the full initiative title was Eliminates Rights of Same-Sex Couples to Marry, sought to demote LGBTQ relationships to second-class status. It took years before that damage could be rectified through the courts. But the same contempt that enacted Prop 8 still permeates the conversation on LGBTQ rights. Religious extremists argue against same-sex couples having children, fight to legalize employment discrimination, and cite the Bible to dehumanize and degrade LGBTQ people. Religious freedom is a buzzword that has come to represent state-sanctioned bigotry. Religious exemptions allow right-wing Americans to issue laws meant to protect everyone equally. In recent years, religious opposition has been the single greatest force preventing LGBTQ people from equal treatment under the law. That should be jarring to anyone who believes in justice for all, but especially those who understand the sting of faith-based discrimination. Among these groups are atheists, plus agnostics, humanists, non-believers, and others who don't believe in the existence of any gods. Atheists opt out of religious doctrine altogether, but nonetheless face much of the same harsh rhetoric from religious conservatives as LGBTQ people do. The deliberate use of religion to cause harm should infuriate atheists and spur them to act. Religious groups, one in particular, forced LGBTQ Californians to wait years for the basic right to marry. It's hard not to wonder, could organized non-believers have stopped them? The idea that atheists belong in social movements is not new. It stems in part from the natural kinship some atheists have with other groups persecuted by the religious right. Some non-believers argue that being an atheist should begin and end with just that, non-belief. They claim that there is nothing inherently political about atheism, and that there is no connection between atheism and progressive social causes like LGBTQ equality, feminism, racial justice, and so on. But remaining silent on issues of inequality, especially when inequality is propelled by religious overreach, is antithetical to the purpose of organizing around atheism. Over and over, LGBTQ people have been berated, belittled, and bullied on the faulty premise that God frowns upon them. This erroneous explanation not only targets LGBTQ people, but also contradicts ideas many atheists hold dear. For example, when a pastor preaches that God unleashed Hurricane Sandy as punishment for same-sex marriage, as anti-gay preacher John McTernan did, that's not just an affront to LGBTQ people, it's an affront to science. When a county clerk cites religion as an excuse to deny LGBTQ people equal treatment, as Kentucky's Kim Davis did, that's a slap in the face to the separation of church and state. And when Christian schools that receive state funding fire LGBTQ teachers, as we've seen across the country, it's a clear abuse of power disguised as religious exemption. Science, reason, and a government free of religious influence are some of the most crucial tenets of secular humanism. Atheists, even those who believe that philosophy begins and ends with the rejection of God's existence, should be deeply offended when those principles are so egregiously violated. Atheism itself is still somewhat of a subversive practice. People of faith comprise around 3/4 of the U.S. population. About 24% are unaffiliated or religious nones, with self-declared atheists making up only 3.4% of the country. As of this writing, there are no openly atheist members of Congress. In some countries, being an atheist, being LGBTQ, or both, are cause for persecution or even death. And of course, there are LGBTQ atheists in the United States and elsewhere who are doubly marginalized for identifying as both. It is in the atheist nature to eschew societal norms in favor of ideas that feel more true to them. Joining forces with others targeted by religious groups shouldn't be controversial. In fact, it should be expected. Some people, though not usually atheists, actually argue against taking religion out of politics, citing the civil right to free expression. And sure, the First Amendment has its place in these conversations. A person who pushes homophobia or transphobia under the guise of religion is allowed those opinions privately and even publicly to an extent. But once religious beliefs are invoked to interfere with the civil rights of others, say to justify firing a qualified employee, or to provide a legal loophole for segregating LGBTQ customers, the First Amendment exits the equation. Personal beliefs cannot infringe upon the rights of others to pursue life and liberty however they choose. If atheists sit idly by as religious Americans target LGBTQ communities, they are endorsing it. And yet America's failure to protect LGBTQ citizens is a direct result of the overstepping of religion into politics. It's a flagrant rejection of the Establishment Clause and a refusal to prioritize objectivity and fairness. Equal rights for LGBTQ people should come naturally to a society that operates on evidence and reason, the kind of society atheists generally advocate for. Atheists should be invested in removing religious influence from the rule of law, and they do their own cause a disservice when they fail to defend LGBTQ people, politically and personally. As both an atheist and a queer person, I'm doubly baffled by the intensity of religious hatred against my people, all my people. I write a lot about LGBTQ issues, and I received countless anonymous messages, and some not anonymous, outlining all the reasons I'm a hell-bound dyke. Sometimes the message is just a list of Bible verses, as if I'm going to take out my copy of the New Testament and flip through it to learn why my life displeases a higher power whose existence I reject. I'm lucky to have lived mostly in liberal parts of the country, not that religious bigotry doesn't exist in all 50 states, and that I've never faced faith-based discrimination outright, but thousands of others aren't as fortunate. LGBTQ people are fired, kicked out of their homes, pushed out of local businesses, and refused social and health services because of the, quote, religious consciences of others. To make matters worse, we don't even know exactly how many LGBTQ people face discrimination every year. As in other situations, when victims must choose whether to report what's happened to them, many people refrain out of the fear of retaliation, outing, or worse. And just because it hasn't happened to me yet, there's no guarantee that it won't in the future. LGBTQ people and atheists aren't the only groups hurt by religious fundamentalism. For example, the religious right targets women with a similar fervor. Employers fight to deny insurance coverage for birth control on the grounds of religious freedom. Women are fired for being pregnant and unmarried. Puritanical beliefs about women's rights and roles trickle down into other elements of society. The wage gap and sexism in the media aren't necessarily a result of religious misogyny, but they're peddled by a lot of the same people. And historically, though not long ago at all, people deployed religious arguments to defend segregation and other manifestations of racism. Quote, in the 1960s, we saw institutions object to laws requiring integration in restaurants because of sincerely held beliefs that God wanted the races to be separate. It's according to the ACLU. Integration was seen as an affront to God. Bob Jones University, a fundamentalist Protestant school in South Carolina, didn't drop its ban on interracial dating until the year 2000. When you consider how extreme the consequences of bigotry can be, the harassment and disrespect atheists face for their own non-belief can seem pretty mild in comparison. Society certainly doesn't embrace atheists, but there are far fewer attacks, physical, legal, and otherwise, on atheist, quote, lifestyles than on LGBTQ people, women, people of color, or even other religious groups. But plenty of atheists can be and are members of all these groups, facing attacks not for their non-beliefs, but for visible elements of their identity. Virtually every minority group in the world has faced some defamation, discrimination, or mistreatment at the hands of religious extremism, one way or another. It only makes sense that we would rally together in our respective times of need. Why LGBTQ people in particular? Because when it comes to religious suppression of civil rights, LGBTQ people have too much at stake. In recent years, the religious right has focused much of its energy and resources on limiting or even eliminating the rights of LGBTQ people. Anti-LGBTQ ideals littered the 2016 Republican Party platform and continue to serve as talking points for many GOP politicians, even though religious beliefs are supposed to be absent from the legislative process. According to the Human Rights Campaign, the largest LGBTQ rights group in the country, only 4 Republican senators and 7 Republican members of the House of Representatives supported marriage equality in the lead-up to the 2016 election. Even Barack Obama, arguably the most progressive president in U.S. history, certainly on this issue, didn't announce his support for marriage equality until the end of his first term, after a handful of states had already enacted same-sex marriage and Proposition 8 had twice been ruled unconstitutional. LGBTQ issues have never been more visible, and anti-LGBTQ religious extremists have never been more fired up. If equal rights advocates don't fight back aggressively, we can expect sweeping victories for state-approved religious bigotry. That kind of upheaval would deal a significant blow to atheism, too. Imagine trying to defend secular education, the scientific method, or the separation of church and state in a country that explicitly favors one belief system over others, let alone over non-belief. We may be a long ways off from falling into an extremist religious dystopia, but it's still worth keeping our guard up. And it's not enough for atheist and LGBTQ people to be allies in name alone. In order for both these groups to be treated with civility and humanity, we must support each other loudly and unapologetically in our schools and our workplaces, at the dinner table, and at the ballot box. In 2015, atheist writer Adam Lee penned an editorial for The Guardian with the headline, "If peace on earth is our goal, atheism might be the means to that end." While that sentence might suggest a simplistic answer to a complicated problem, there is little evidence for more religious influence leading to social harmony. LGBTQ people have been political targets for decades. As society slowly begins to see us with more empathy than ever before, we deserve the peace we've been denied for so long. Atheists must help us get there. I didn't always know I was queer. Not everyone realizes it right away. But I've been wondering where I fell on the spectrum of religious belief since I was a kid. When I was 11 and just starting middle school, some of my new friends were strongly Christian. I didn't have much of a religious leaning. My mother's family is Catholic and my father's family is Jewish, so I grew up celebrating twice as many holidays, but lacked grounding in any particular teachings. So when my new friends told me about a Bible study guide they loved, one that was targeted toward hip Christian teens, I thought it'd be a neat way to join the youth group going in crowd. As far as I was concerned, I was passively agnostic, but I thought having the tools to find faith might make me feel more certain one way or the other. A friend's mom bought me the trendy teen Bible as an early birthday present. I was ecstatic to receive it. It was brightly colored, used wacky fonts, and had discussion pages at the ends of some sections, making parallels between scripture and teen issues like school and dating. But there were some red flags right off the bat that made me think this might not be for me. For example, I'd never had strong feelings about premarital sex, but my friends and this Bible did. I figured sex would happen when it happened, and between talking with my parents, my lackluster public school sex ed, and 17 magazine, I had a decent grasp on how not to get pregnant. My Bible's all-or-nothing take on sex and dating made me uneasy, like a stranger giving me serious advice I hadn't asked for. I didn't even bother looking at the discussion notes on gay people. I didn't know yet that they applied to me. I recently dug that Bible out from my pile of rejected childhood items to find that section. It's not pretty. Then I found something that I took more personally. A small section of the sex and dating chapter included a stern footnote about dating non-Christians. Quote, "Don't do it," it said. "It's never a good idea." I asked my parents about it, and whether or not God thought their interfaith marriage, and therefore my existence, was a bad idea. They said they talked about it a long time ago and decided that because they both believed in God, the details didn't matter. But it was enough to turn me off of religious exploration for a long time. When I came out as bisexual in high school, I felt even less connected to my friends' stories about church programs and their excitement about applying to Christian colleges. And eventually I realized I didn't need to explore anymore. The belief just wasn't there. This isn't to say I disparage or disrespect those who do find comfort in faith. There are thriving communities of LGBTQ people of faith around the world, some of whom belong to progressive houses of worship and others who practice independent spirituality, who find that their faith and their LGBTQ identity strengthen one another. Today, more and more religious groups celebrate diversity, actively support LGBTQ people, and speak out against the institutions that use Scripture to oppress and demean. Unfortunately, these groups are in the minority. While there are avenues for LGBTQ people to work with faith groups, the potential for allyship between LGBTQ people and atheists is far more intuitive and certainly presents fewer institutional boundaries. When I started writing about LGBTQ issues for Hemant Mehta's blog, Friendly Atheist, which is how this book came to be, I was often stumped by the lack of news about the explicit overlaps between LGBTQ people and atheists. Stories about active collaborations between these two groups were sparse. All I seemed to read and write were stories of outrageous homophobic and transphobic behavior by conservative churches and evangelical politicians, all in the name of God. What I didn't immediately realize, though, is that religious groups oppressing LGBTQ people is an atheist issue. Any abuse of religious freedom, particularly at the expense of a marginalized group, is an atheist issue. That's how I reframed my work for the blog, and that's the lens through which I wrote this book. These chapters are an examination of the ways atheists and LGBTQ people are natural allies, the way these groups can learn from and support one another, the reasons atheists have a responsibility to support human rights issues like LGBTQ equality, and most importantly, why it's crucial that we do so without delay or hesitation. That is from the introduction to the soon-to-be-published book, Queer Disbelief, written by Camille Beredjick, recounting part of her own story, and I am fascinated. The book needs our help to get across its publishing goal. I have included the link to the Kickstarter page in the description box of this broadcast. If this resonates with you, and I certainly hope it does, I hope you'll toss a few bucks toward the cause, a worthy endeavor, and a wonderful read. Congratulations to Camille Beredjick for some very good, very compelling writing, and a very healthy and I think necessary perspective on why we as atheists should be involved in so many of these fights against religious discrimination in this world. Thank you so much for listening today. Thanks again to Hemant Mehta and Camille Beredjick for lending their perspectives in this portion of the book. I'll be back next Tuesday as we get in the Halloween spirit to enjoy some ghost stories. So get ready to gather around the virtual campfire, and I will see you then. Take care.
Follow The Thinking Atheist on Facebook and Twitter. Watch dozens of original videos on the Thinking Atheist YouTube channel. And visit our website for resources, links, contact information, the editor's blog, and more. thethinkingatheist.com.